Dr. Danielle Carter, a respected black doctor, boards a flight expecting rest, but instead faces prejudice when another passenger demands she be moved to economy class. Tensions rise, but when that same passenger's son has a sudden medical emergency, Danielle is the only one who can save him. Will she set aside discrimination and step in to help? Watch the full story to see how one moment of injustice turns into a life-changing event for everyone involved. Subscribe for more inspiring stories and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Danielle's situation? The evening sky above Seattle was painted in deep hues of violet and orange, the city's skyscrapers gleaming in the fading light as Dr. Danielle Carter stepped out of the conference center. The brisk air was a welcome change from the stuffy atmosphere inside, where she'd spent the last 3 days surrounded by colleagues and experts in emergency medicine. The prestigious Global Emergency Medicine Summit had come to an end, and Danielle was ready for a break from the relentless networking, smiling, and formalities. She walked slowly, pulling her small suitcase behind her, the familiar weight of her carry-on bag slung over her shoulder. The badge from the conference still dangled around her neck, identifying her as Dr. Danielle Carter, emergency physician. But for once, she was glad to be shedding that identity, if only for a few hours. All she wanted now was peace and quiet. It had been a whirlwind week. Danielle had given a keynote speech on innovative emergency response techniques, a milestone in her career. She was one of the few black women in her field to have risen to such prominence, and while the recognition was gratifying, the pressure had been immense. The constant need to prove herself, to excel in a predominantly white, male-dominated space, weighed on her more than she liked to admit. She hailed a cab, sliding into the back seat and sighing as the driver loaded her luggage into the trunk. The smooth leather of the seat was a small comfort as she sank into it, feeling her muscles slowly unclench. She had planned this trip meticulously, arranging for a first-class seat on her flight back to Atlanta. It was a small luxury, but after the intensity of the conference, she felt she had earned it. SeaTac Airport, please, she said softly to the driver. As the car pulled away from the curb, Danielle allowed herself a rare moment of introspection. The jazz playing faintly on the radio blended with the hum of the engine, and for the first time in days she could hear her own thoughts. She looked out at the city through the window, the buildings towering over the streets filled with people moving in every direction, each of them caught up in their own lives. It was in moments like these that Danielle felt most distant from the world around her. She leaned her head against the cool window, watching the skyline blur by as the cab wove through the downtown traffic. Though the city was alive with energy, Danielle felt removed from it, floating through her thoughts, lingering on her exhaustion, and the way every achievement in her life seemed to require twice the effort of her peers. That was the reality of being a black woman in a profession that still, despite the progress, often seemed determined to remind her she was an outsider. She thought of the panel discussion on diversity in medicine she had attended on the last day of the summit. Though the room had been full of polite smiles and nods, there was an underlying tension in the air. An unspoken acknowledgement that for people like Danielle, success came not just from talent, but from enduring slights and dismissals that her colleagues rarely encountered. Dr. Carter, could you expand on the challenges you faced as a woman of color in the medical field? One of the moderators had asked. Her tone was almost too sympathetic. Danielle had smiled, offering the polished answer she always gave at these events, a carefully measured mix of optimism and realism. But the truth, the one she didn't often voice, was that it wasn't just the overt instances of racism that were hard to bear. It was the constant, unspoken assumptions, like the way some people's eyes widened slightly when they realized she was the lead physician, or the subtle way patients sometimes questioned her credentials in ways they never did with her white colleagues. As the airport came into view, Danielle pulled herself from her thoughts. The cab slowed to a stop at the curb, and the driver handed her luggage to a nearby porter. She thanked him, paid the fare, and walked through the sliding glass doors into the bustling terminal. The chaos of the airport swirled around her, families rushing to their gates, flight announcements blaring from the loudspeakers, and the endless hum of rolling suitcases. Danielle moved through it all with practiced ease, already visualizing the comfort of her first-class seat and the brief respite it would offer her. The check-in counter for first-class passengers was tucked away in a quieter corner of the terminal. As Danielle approached, she was greeted by a smiling airline attendant. The young woman glanced at Danielle's conference badge with interest, before offering a polite, if somewhat rehearsed, greeting. "Good evening, Dr. Carter. Headed back home?" "Yes, back to Atlanta," Danielle replied, returning the smile. The attendant quickly processed her information, scanning her ticket and passport. As she handed back Danielle's documents, she tilted her head slightly. "Long trip?" Danielle nodded, feeling the weariness deep in her bones. "It's been a busy week." The woman gave her a sympathetic look. "Well, I hope you enjoy your flight. First class should offer you a nice break." "Thank you," Danielle said, taking her boarding pass and moving toward the security line reserved for first-class passengers. As she stood in line, Danielle took a moment to reflect on the strangeness of airports, the way they seem to exist in their own dimension, a liminal space between destinations, where people came and went without truly inhabiting the place. It was one of the few places she found a kind of peace, a place where she could blend into the crowd and simply be another traveler. The security process was quick, and before long she was strolling through the spacious concourse, her eyes scanning the shops and restaurants lining the terminal. She wasn't hungry, but the familiar routine of walking through an airport gave her a sense of normalcy after the intense days she had spent at the conference. As she passed a newsstand, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass. She paused for a moment, studying her appearance. Her dark brown skin glowed softly under the fluorescent lights, and her short, tightly coiled hair was styled neatly, framing her face in a way that exuded both confidence and calm. Her professional attire, pressed slacks and a sleek blouse, reflected the career she had fought so hard to build, but there was a weariness in her eyes that no amount of professional poise could hide. Danielle's thoughts drifted as she continued walking. She reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point in her life, a journey filled with obstacles, both personal and professional. Being a Black woman in medicine had always been challenging, but she had persevered. Yet even as she made her mark in the field, there was always a part of her that remained guarded, aware of the subtle biases that still lingered. She made her way to her gate, scanning the area for a seat. A few passengers were already waiting, but Danielle gravitated toward an empty spot by the window. She sank into the chair and glanced at her phone, checking for any last-minute emails from the hospital. As expected, there were several messages waiting for her, questions about upcoming shifts, updates on patients, and requests for her input on various cases. Danielle quickly responded to a few of the more urgent emails, but her heart wasn't in it. The familiar pull of her responsibilities as a physician was ever present. But for now, she wanted to push it aside. She needed this flight to be a moment of respite, a chance to reset before diving back into the fast-paced world of the ER. The boarding announcement came soon after, and Danielle was among the first to stand and head toward the gate. The airline attendant scanned her boarding pass with a smile, and Danielle stepped onto the jet bridge, the noise of the airport fading behind her. The moment Danielle stepped into the first-class cabin, she felt a small wave of relief wash over her. The plush, wide leather seats and the soft lighting created an atmosphere that was worlds away from the bustling terminal. A flight attendant greeted her warmly, offering to stow her carry-on in the overhead bin. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Carter. Let us know if you need anything during the flight," the attendant said with a smile. Danielle nodded politely, her tired smile barely hiding the exhaustion she felt. "Thank you. I think I just need some quiet," she replied, settling into her seat. As she adjusted the seat's recline and put her noise-canceling headphones around her neck, she allowed herself to relax for the first time in what felt like days. The hum of the plane's engines, the soft murmur of the few other passengers already seated, it all created a sense of calm that Danielle desperately needed. She was about to close her eyes when she noticed a small commotion near the front of the cabin. A young boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, was fidgeting with his seatbelt, his face scrunched up in frustration. His mother, a tall, slender white woman, was busy arranging their bags in the overhead compartment, her expression tight with annoyance. Danielle's instincts kicked in before she could stop herself. She leaned forward slightly and smiled at the boy. "Here, let me help you with that," she said gently, reaching over to fasten the seatbelt for him. The boy, Cody, looked up at her with wide eyes, his frustration melting into a grateful smile. "Thanks," he chirped, his enthusiasm infectious. Danielle smiled back, but as she leaned back into her seat, she caught the cold glance of the boy's mother. Her expression was neutral, but there was something in the way she looked at Danielle that sent a familiar chill down her spine, a tightness around her mouth, a subtle narrowing of her eyes. Danielle had seen it before, countless times. It was a look that spoke volumes without saying a word. She brushed it off, convincing herself that the woman was probably just stressed from traveling with a young child. But the moment lingered, casting a shadow over the peace Danielle had hoped to find on this flight. More passengers flew into the first-class cabin, but Danielle barely noticed. She was too focused on trying to let go of the nagging feeling that had taken Danielle, tried to shake off the unease, leaning her head back against the plush headrest. Her plan was simple: tune out, close her eyes, and lose herself in the quiet hum of the plane as it took off into the sky. But the look from Cody's mother, that sharp, silent judgment, stayed with her longer than it should have. Traveling had always been a solitary experience for Danielle, a chance to disconnect from the world and its constant demands. She usually enjoyed flying for this very reason. It was a pocket of time where no one could reach her, where she didn't have to wear the mantle of Dr. Danielle Carter, the constantly composed and professional emergency room physician. But tonight, that mantle felt heavier than usual, and the first-class cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt slightly stifling. She took out her phone again, glancing at her emails, more reminders of the work waiting for her at the hospital back in Atlanta. She scanned the messages without really reading them, more out of habit than necessity. A soft sigh escaped her lips as she closed her inbox and put the phone away. The weight of the conference, the constant need to perform, and now this tiny moment of racial tension that she couldn't quite ignore. It all swirled in her mind, making it impossible to relax. As the flight attendants began the routine safety demonstration, Danielle leaned her head against the window, watching the runway lights blur as the plane slowly taxied. She closed her eyes, hoping to finally drift off, even just for a few minutes. But just as she started to sink into the quiet, she heard a voice from behind her, sharp and irritated. "I'm not sitting next to her!" Danielle's eyes snapped open. For a moment, she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. The voice was hushed but unmistakably firm, the kind of tone that suggested the speaker was holding back their true frustration. Danielle sat up straighter in her seat, straining to hear more. She glanced over her shoulder, just enough to catch a glimpse of the woman's face, Cody's mother. "I'm sorry, ma'am," a flight attendant's voice responded, gentle but clearly confused. "Is there a problem?" "Yes, there's a problem," the woman hissed, her voice growing a bit louder now, her annoyance obvious. "I don't want to sit next to her." Danielle felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't the words themselves that stung. It was the venom with which they were spoken. She knew immediately that the woman wasn't talking about seating arrangements or personal space. This was about her, about the color of her skin. A wave of nausea rolled through her, though she tried to fight it. Her grip tightened around the armrests of her seat as the familiar heat of indignation rose in her chest. She wanted to say something, to turn around and confront the woman who had dared to speak about her as if she weren't even human. But years of experience had taught her to pause, to wait. Danielle took a deep breath, her mind racing as she weighed her options. She had faced worse, subtle and not so subtle instances of racism throughout her life, both inside and outside the hospital. There had been patients who refused to let her touch them, staff members who underestimated her abilities, and countless moments where her competence was questioned simply because she didn't fit the image they expected. But this was something else. This was pure, unfiltered disdain, spilling out from the woman's mouth as though she had every right to demand that Danielle be removed simply because she existed. The flight attendant hesitated, clearly flustered by the situation. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but all the seats are assigned. We're fully booked in first class. There's no other place to move you." "Then move her to another seat," the woman snapped, her voice rising in pitch, the anger barely restrained. "I paid for first class, and I expect to be treated properly." Danielle's heart pounded in her chest, the blood rushing to her ears. She could feel the weight of other passengers' eyes on her, but no one said a word. The silence around her felt oppressive, like a thick blanket of indifference. She wasn't surprised, but it still stung. No one ever spoke up in moments like this. The flight attendant looked toward Danielle, her expression torn and apologetic. Danielle knew what was coming before the woman even opened her mouth. This wasn't the first time someone had asked her to make others more comfortable at her expense. "Dr. Carter, I'm so sorry for the inconvenience," the flight attendant began, her voice hesitant. "Would it be possible for you to—" Danielle's stomach twisted. Here it was, the familiar request. "Could you please be the one to move? Could you please be the one to give up your seat, your peace, your dignity, so someone else could feel more at ease in their bigotry?" She'd been here before, in different forms and settings. It always felt the same. For a moment she wanted to refuse. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to stand her ground, to demand the respect she deserved. She had earned her place in first class, not just by paying for the ticket, but by enduring years of hard work, by becoming one of the most respected emergency physicians in her field. She deserved to sit here just as much as anyone else. But the exhaustion, the bone-deep fatigue from the conference, and the lifetime of fighting these battles weighed heavily on her. She was tired, so tired of always being the one who had to rise above, who had to take the high road, who had to be the bigger person. It wasn't fair. It was never fair. But fairness had never been the world Danielle lived in. With a deep breath, Danielle slowly unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, collecting her things with a deliberate calmness that belied the storm brewing inside her. The woman, the one who had demanded her removal, watched with a smug satisfaction, her arms crossed over her chest as though she had won some sort of victory. Danielle didn't look at her. She turned to the flight attendant, who looked visibly relieved, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you so much, Doctor Carter," she whispered, her tone genuinely apologetic. "I'll find you a seat in economy." Danielle nodded without a word. She could feel the stares of the other passengers as she made her way to the back of the plane, their silence like a knife in her gut. Some of them had probably heard the whole exchange, but no one had spoken up. No one had intervened. It was always easier to pretend it wasn't their problem. She reached the cramped economy section and settled into her new seat, which was a stark contrast to the luxury she had just left behind. The armrests dug into her sides and there was barely enough room for her legs. But that wasn't what bothered her. It was humiliation. The way she had been made to feel small, invisible, and unworthy of the comfort and space she had paid for. As the plane took off into the night sky, Danielle stared out the window, watching the city lights fade into the distance. Her reflection in the glass stared back at her, strong, poised, but undeniably hurt. She tried to focus on her breathing, to calm the rising tide of frustration and anger that threatened to overwhelm her. She hadn't asked for this. All she had wanted was to get home in peace, to enjoy a few hours of quiet before returning to the chaos of the emergency room. But once again, she had been reminded that no matter how far she had come, no matter how successful she was, there were still people who would see her as less than. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a notification from the hospital reminding her of her upcoming shift. She grimaced, turning it off without reading the message. The job never really let go, even when she was miles away from her responsibilities. But tonight, the weight of the hospital's demands was nothing compared to the weight of what had just happened. Danielle leaned her head against the window, closing her eyes as the plane cruised at 30,000 feet. She tried to let the steady hum of the engines soothe her, but the events of the past hour played on a loop in her mind. No matter how hard she tried to brush it off, the sting of those words, that cold look of dismissal from Cody's mother, cut deeper than she expected. The silence in the cabin was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional murmur of voices and the clinking of glasses in first class. Danielle couldn't help but wonder how many of the other passengers had watched the scene unfold and done nothing, their indifference almost as painful as the woman's outright hostility. She took another deep breath, trying to remind herself that she was stronger than this. She had faced worse, overcome greater obstacles, and built a life that most people could only dream of. But even as she repeated those words in her mind, the bitterness lingered. It always did. Danielle sat stiffly in the cramped economy seat, her shoulders brushing uncomfortably against the edges of the chair. The shift from the spacious luxury of the first class to the tight confines of the economy was jarring, not just physically, but emotionally. She had been relegated to this space not because of any seating error, but because of someone's unspoken prejudice. The low hum of conversation around her felt distant, almost like a muffled soundtrack to her thoughts. She glanced out the window, watching the dark night sky swallow up the last glimmers of city lights far below. The rhythmic whoosh of the plane's engines should have been calming, but instead it only amplified the tension coiling inside her chest. Danielle's mind buzzed with a cocktail of frustration, disappointment, and exhaustion. There was a time when she would have fought back, when she might have spoken up, demanded respect, and refused to be moved from her rightful seat. But tonight, the weight of countless similar encounters over the years was too heavy to carry. The subtle and overt slights she had faced throughout her career had piled up like stones, each one adding to the burden until it felt unbearable. She closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the headrest. She was used to being underestimated. Even as a young girl growing up in Georgia, Danielle had learned quickly that the world wasn't fair for people who looked like her. Teachers had doubted her abilities despite her natural aptitude for science and math. And later, even in medical school, she had encountered professors and classmates who saw her as an outsider. But she had pushed through. She had risen above every challenge, every slight, and built a life for herself that most people could only dream of. And yet, here she was, once again forced to compromise her dignity for the comfort of someone else's ignorance. Danielle shifted in her seat, feeling the tightness in her chest grow. She thought about how she had handled the situation back in first class, how she had swallowed her pride and moved without making a scene. She knew it was the right thing to do in terms of maintaining her composure, but part of her wished she had stood her ground. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of laughter from across the aisle. Danielle glanced over to see a group of businessmen chatting loudly, their suits and ties slightly askew as they settled into their seats. One of them, a middle-aged man with a silver tie, leaned over to his companion with a smirk. "Looks like someone couldn't handle first class," he muttered, his voice low but not low enough to be missed. Danielle's jaw tightened as she turned her gaze back to the window. She could feel the familiar burn of anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had long ago mastered the art of masking her emotions, of keeping her face neutral and composed even when every fiber of her being wanted to lash out. But tonight, it was harder than usual. The man's words echoed in her mind, reminding her of the countless times people had questioned her place in spaces she had earned through hard work and perseverance. Whether it was a hospital boardroom or a first-class cabin, there were always people who assumed she didn't belong. Danielle took a deep breath, trying to let the anger roll off her, but it clung to her like a shadow, refusing to be ignored. She glanced down at her phone, checking the time. The flight had barely begun, and the thought of enduring several more hours of this tension made her stomach churn. Suddenly, the plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting her in her seat. The overhead bins rattled, and the passengers around her murmured nervously, their voices rising as the plane shook. Danielle gripped the armrest, steadying herself as the turbulence passed, but her mind was elsewhere, consumed by the simmering frustration that had been building since she stepped onto the plane. As the turbulence subsided, Danielle's thoughts drifted back to her time in medical school, the beginning of her journey into a world that often felt unwelcoming. She remembered the long nights of studying, the endless rounds of clinical rotations, and the constant pressure to prove herself. There had been moments of triumph, yes, but there had also been moments of deep doubt, times when she wondered if the weight of her identity was too much to bear in a field that didn't always value her contributions. One particular memory surfaced, her third year of medical school, during her first clinical rotation in the emergency department. She had been eager, full of energy, and ready to learn, but her enthusiasm had been met with skepticism by one of the attending physicians, Dr. Richardson, an older white man with a gruff demeanor. He hadn't bothered to hide his doubts about her abilities. During a particularly busy night, Danielle had been the first to respond to a patient in critical condition, an older woman who had gone into cardiac arrest. Danielle had acted quickly, performing chest compressions and guiding the medical team with confidence that belied her inexperience. The patient had survived, and the rest of the team had praised Danielle's quick thinking. But Dr. Richardson had barely acknowledged her role in the patient's survival. Instead, he had pulled her aside afterward, his tone cold and condescending. "You were lucky this time," he had said, his eyes narrowing. "But don't get too comfortable. You've got a lot to prove if you want to make it in this field." The words had stung, but Danielle had forced herself to smile and nod, knowing that any sign of weakness would only fuel his doubts. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned her abilities, and it wouldn't be the last. But she had pushed through, determined to rise above the judgments of people like Dr. Richardson. Now, sitting in the cramped economy seat, those memories felt all too familiar. The faces had changed, but the underlying bias remained the same. She was still fighting for space in a world that often refused to make room for her. Danielle sighed, closing her eyes as she tried to shake off the heaviness of the past. She was stronger now, more resilient. She had built a career as a respected emergency physician, and no one could take that away from her. But even so, the scars from those early years still lingered, surfacing in moments like this, when she was reminded that no matter how far she had come, the world still saw her in ways she couldn't control. The plane leveled out, the turbulence fading into a gentle hum once again. Danielle forced herself to relax, taking slow, deep breaths as she focused on the steady rhythm of the engines. She needed to clear her mind, to let go of the tension that had settled in her chest. After all, there was nothing she could do now. She had chosen to move to the economy to avoid a confrontation, and now all she could do was endure the long flight ahead. But just as she began to drift into a light sleep, she heard it, a sound that pierced through the quiet hum of the cabin like a sharp alarm. A child's cry, high-pitched and filled with panic. Danielle's eyes snapped open, her heart immediately racing. She recognized that cry. It was Cody. Danielle's instincts kicked in immediately, all traces of exhaustion and frustration wiped away as she sprang to attention. Her eyes darted toward the front of the cabin, where she saw Cody, the young boy she had helped with his seatbelt, struggling in his seat. His small hands clutched at his throat, his face red and twisted in fear as he gasped for air. A familiar sense of dread settled over Danielle as she realized what was happening. Cody was happening. Without thinking, Danielle unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, moving quickly down the aisle toward Cody's seat in first class. The flight attendants were already hovering nearby, their faces pale with concern, but they were clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. Cody's mother, the same woman who had demanded Danielle be moved, was frantic. Her hands fluttered uselessly around Cody, her voice high and panicked as she pleaded with him to breathe. But it was clear that Cody couldn't. His breaths were shallow and strained, each one a desperate gasp for air that wasn't reaching his lungs. Danielle didn't wait for permission. She moved swiftly to Cody's side, kneeling beside his seat and placing a gentle hand on his back. "I'm a doctor," Danielle said firmly, addressing both the flight attendants and Cody's mother. "He's having an asthma attack. Does he have an inhaler?" Cody's mother, Melissa, as Danielle recalled from overhearing her name earlier, looked up at Danielle, her face a mixture of terror and shock. For a moment, she seemed unable to process what Danielle had said, her eyes wide and unfocused. But then, as if snapping out of a trance, she shook her head frantically. "No! No, he left it in the car!" Melissa's voice was trembling, her hands shaking as she clutched Cody's small arm. I thought he wouldn't need it." Danielle's heart sank. An asthma attack at 30,000 feet without an inhaler was a dangerous situation. They needed to get Cody's breathing under control, and fast. "Listen to me," Danielle said, her voice calm and authoritative as she addressed Melissa. "I need you to help me keep him calm. The more he panics, the harder it will be for him to breathe. Can you do that?" Melissa nodded, her eyes brimming with tears as she reached for Cody's hand, trying to soothe him despite her own panic. Danielle turned to the flight attendant nearest to her, who was hovering anxiously by Cody's seat. "I need oxygen, now," Danielle said, her tone leaving no room for hesitation. "Bring me an oxygen mask and tank, and any other medical supplies you have on board." The flight attendant nodded quickly and rushed off to retrieve the supplies. Danielle turned her attention back to Cody, who was still gasping for air, his small chest rising and falling in uneven, frantic movements. "Hey, Cody," Danielle said softly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I'm going to help you, okay? But I need you to try and breathe slowly with me. Can you do that? Take a deep breath, like this." She demonstrated taking a slow, deep breath and letting it out in a steady stream. Cody tried to mimic her, but his breaths were shallow and labored. His eyes, wide with fear, locked onto Danielle's, and in that moment, she could see the trust he placed in her. Despite the panic, despite the pain, he believed that she could help him. The flight attendant returned with the oxygen tank, and Danielle wasted no time attaching the mask to Cody's face. She adjusted the flow of oxygen, watching closely as his breathing began to slow, though it was still labored. Melissa, her voice choked with emotion, whispered to her son, "You're going to be okay, baby. Just keep breathing. Dr. Carter's helping you." Danielle glanced at Melissa, noting the change in her tone, the softness, the gratitude that hadn't been there before. The same woman who had looked at her with such disdain only hours earlier was now relying on her to save her son's life. But there was no time to dwell on that. Cody's breathing was still unstable, and without his inhaler, they were relying entirely on the oxygen to keep him calm. Danielle focused all her attention on Cody, guiding him through each breath, her hands steady on his shoulder. Her voice remained calm, even as her mind raced with potential scenarios. They needed to stabilize him. If his condition worsened, they would have no choice but to make an emergency landing. As she worked, Danielle could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, their earlier indifference replaced by something closer to respect. But she didn't care about that now. All that mattered was keeping Cody safe. Cody's breathing had begun to stabilize thanks to the steady flow of oxygen, but his condition was still precarious. Danielle remained kneeling beside him, monitoring his pulse and watching for any signs of further distress. Melissa sat beside her son, her eyes never leaving Cody's face. But there was something else in her gaze now, something deeper, more vulnerable. Danielle could feel the shift in the air between them. Melissa had gone from treating Danielle like an intruder to relying on her completely. It wasn't just desperation, it was a realization that she had been wrong. Wrong to judge Danielle, wrong to make assumptions based on nothing more than skin color. "I don't know what I would have done without you," Melissa whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. For everything." Danielle didn't respond immediately. She kept her focus on Cody, adjusting the oxygen mask as he began to take deeper, more regular breaths. But she could feel the weight of Melissa's words, the unspoken apology hanging in the air between them. Melissa's voice cracked as she spoke again, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I judged you. I treated you terribly. I can't believe I did that." Danielle finally met Melissa's gaze, her expression calm but unreadable. "Let's focus on Cody right now," she said softly. "We'll deal with the rest later." Melissa nodded, swallowing hard as she wiped away a tear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Danielle turned her attention back to Cody, feeling a strange mixture of emotions swirling inside her. She wasn't looking for gratitude or an apology, but the shift in Melissa's tone, in her attitude, was undeniable. It was a reminder of how quickly perceptions could change, how easily someone could go from viewing you as less than to realizing that their life, or the life of someone they loved, was in your hands. The cabin had gone quiet, the tension palpable as the other passengers watched the scene unfold. Danielle could sense their collective unease, their discomfort with what had happened earlier, now overshadowed by their concern for Cody. She had become the center of their attention, not because of her skin color, but because she was the person saving a child's life. For a moment, Danielle allowed herself to feel the weight of it all, the exhaustion, the frustration, the injustice of having to prove her worth over and over again. But she didn't let it consume her. There would be time for reflection later. Right now, her focus was on keeping Cody stable. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the tension in the cabin began to ease. Cody's breathing was now regular, and though his face was still pale, the panic had left his eyes. He clutched his mother's hand tightly, but the terror that had gripped him earlier had subsided. Danielle stood slowly, her knees stiff from kneeling for so long. She glanced at the flight attendant, who was standing nearby with a look of quiet awe on her face. "We'll need to keep him on oxygen until we land," Danielle said, her voice calm but firm. "If anything changes, we'll need to make an emergency landing." The flight attendant nodded quickly, rushing off to inform the captain. Melissa remained seated, her hands still wrapped around Cody's, but her eyes were locked on Danielle, her expression filled with a mixture of guilt and gratitude. As Danielle moved back to her seat, she could feel the eyes of the passengers on her once again, but this time, their gazes were different. There was no judgment, no dismissal. Instead, there was something that looked like respect. She didn't need their validation, but it felt good to know that, in this moment, they saw her for who she really was, a doctor, a professional, and someone who had earned her place in the world, no matter what anyone else thought. Despite the brief relief that came with stabilizing Cody's breathing, Danielle knew better than to let her guard down. Asthma attacks were unpredictable, especially at high altitudes, and without his inhaler, they were merely buying time. The steady flow of oxygen was helping, but it wasn't a cure. Danielle glanced at Cody, his small chest rising and falling under the oxygen mask. He was calm now, but his skin was still pale, and she could hear the faint wheeze in his breathing, a troubling sound that sent a ripple of concern through her. Melissa, still seated beside her son, seemed to sense the lingering tension. She was watching Danielle closely, her earlier panic replaced by a quieter, more fragile worry. Her hands trembled as she stroked Cody's hair, her eyes darting between him and Danielle, as if waiting for some assurance that everything would be okay. Danielle kept her voice steady as she spoke. "He's stable for now, but without his inhaler, we need to be prepared for things to change. We need to stay calm and keep him breathing slowly." Melissa nodded, her face pale and drawn, but there was an unmistakable fear in her eyes. "You're not saying this is over, are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Danielle shook her head slightly, her expression serious. "Number asthma attacks can flare up again without warning, especially in conditions like this. I'll stay with him and monitor his breathing, but if things get worse, we'll need to make an emergency landing." The words seemed to land heavily on Melissa, her mouth opening slightly in shock. She looked down at Cody, her fingers tightening around his hand. "Oh, God! I can't believe this is happening. How could I forget his inhaler?" Danielle heard the guilt creeping into Melissa's voice, but there was no time to address it. She needed to stay focused on the boy in front of her. Cody was still vulnerable, and his breathing was growing more labored by the minute. The low murmur of voices in the cabin had quieted, the other passengers now watching the scene with tense, anxious expressions. It was as if the entire plane was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. As if on cue, Cody's breathing hitched. His small body stiffened, and his hand reached for his throat, his fingers grasping at the air as if trying to pull in more oxygen. Danielle's heart skipped a beat. She moved quickly, kneeling beside Cody again, her mind racing through possible scenarios. His oxygen levels were dropping. The mask wasn't enough anymore. "We need to get more oxygen into him," Danielle said, her voice sharper now as she turned to the flight attendant hovering nearby. "We need to prepare for a descent. I'm serious. We can't wait much longer." Emma, the flight attendant, nodded quickly and rushed off toward the cockpit, her face pale as she spoke into her radio. Danielle returned her focus to Cody, keeping her voice low and steady as she guided him through the next few breaths. "Cody, I need you to take slow breaths, okay?" she said, her hand resting gently on his chest, feeling the rapid, uneven rise and fall of his lungs. "Just stay with me. We're going to get you more help, but I need you to stay calm." But Cody's breaths were becoming more erratic. His eyes, wide and filled with fear, flicked from Danielle to his mother, who was now crying softly beside him, her hand clutching his, as if she could will him to breathe. Danielle felt a surge of urgency. Time was running out, and they were still at cruising altitude, too high for Cody's lungs to handle without proper treatment. They needed to descend, and fast. She turned to Melissa, who was nearly beside herself with fear. "Listen, Melissa," Danielle said firmly, drawing her attention away from her son. "I need you to help me keep him calm. I know it's hard, but the more stressed he gets, the harder it will be for him to breathe." Melissa nodded through her tears, trying to compose herself enough to do what Danielle asked. She leaned closer to Cody, speaking softly to him, her voice trembling, but filled with a mother's desperate love. It's okay, baby. We're going to get you through this. Just keep breathing, okay? Danielle watched as Melissa tried to hold it together, her earlier prejudice and anger forgotten in the face of her son's struggle. There was no room for anything else now. No judgment, no resentment, just the overwhelming fear of a mother who didn't know if her child would make it through the next hour. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, pulling Danielle's attention away from Cody. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been notified of a medical emergency on board. We will be making an emergency descent to Denver International Airport. Flight attendants, prepare for descent. The announcement sent a ripple of murmurs through the cabin, but Danielle felt a wave of relief. They were finally taking action. The plane began its rapid descent almost immediately, the sudden drop in altitude causing a brief pressure shift in the cabin. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, but the urgency of the situation kept them quiet. Danielle remained by Cody's side, her hands steady on his shoulder as she monitored his breathing. The oxygen mask was still in place, but she could see the strain in his small face, the tightness around his eyes, the pale hue of his skin. She leaned in closer, her voice soft but firm. You're doing great, Cody. Just keep taking those deep breaths. We're almost there. Melissa, still holding Cody's hand, glanced up at Danielle, her face streaked with tears. What if we don't get there in time? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Danielle met her gaze, her expression calm but serious. We will. We're doing everything we can right now. You're doing everything you can. Just stay focused on him. Melissa nodded, her lips pressed together as she tried to hold back another sob. The vulnerability in her face was stark. Gone was the haughty, indignant woman who had demanded Danielle be moved. In her place was a mother consumed by fear and guilt. Her entire world narrowed down to the boy struggling for breath beside her. The plane jolted as it hit another patch of turbulence, sending a shudder through the cabin. Danielle braced herself, her fingers tightening around the armrest beside Cody's seat. The descent was rough, fast and bumpy, but they didn't have a choice. They needed to get on the ground as soon as possible. Emma returned from the cockpit, her face tight with concern as she knelt beside Danielle. We're about 15 minutes from landing, she said quietly. The paramedics will be waiting on the tarmac as soon as we touch down. Danielle nodded, keeping her focus on Cody. Good. Tell them he's having a severe asthma attack. We've been using oxygen, but without his inhaler, his airways are still constricted. Emma relayed the information to her radio, her tense voice but professional. Danielle appreciated her efficiency. There was no room for hesitation now. As the plane continued its descent, Danielle glanced around the cabin. The other passengers were watching her, their faces reflecting a range of emotions, fear, concern, and something that resembled awe. The businessmen from earlier, who had mocked her move to the economy, now looked at her with wide eyes as if seeing her for the first time. Danielle didn't care about their opinions. All that mattered was getting Cody through the next few minutes. She could feel the tension in the air, the way the entire plane seemed to be holding its collective breath as they waited for the descent to end. Cody's breathing was still shallow, but his eyes had closed, his small body finally relaxing a little under the steady flow of oxygen. Danielle kept her hand on his shoulder, her heart racing as she counted down the minutes until they landed. For Melissa, each second seemed to stretch into eternity. She couldn't tear her eyes away from her son, her face etched with the kind of fear only a parent could understand. I should have brought his inhaler, she whispered, her voice choked with guilt. How could I be so careless? Danielle's voice was gentle but firm. This isn't your fault, Melissa. You're here now, and that's what matters. You're doing everything you can. Melissa nodded, but the guilt lingered in her eyes. She looked at Danielle again, her expression raw with emotion. I treated you so horribly earlier. I didn't even give you a chance. And now you're the one saving my son's life. Danielle held her gaze for a moment, her face unreadable. We'll talk about that later, she said quietly. Right now, we need to focus on Cody. Melissa's tears fell freely now, but she nodded in agreement, her hands still wrapped around Cody's. Danielle could feel the weight of the unspoken apology between them, but she didn't dwell on it. There would be time to process all of that later. The minutes ticked by, each one agonizingly slow. The plane continued its rapid descent, and Danielle could feel the pressure in the cabin shift as they dropped in altitude. Cody's breathing was still labored, but he was holding on. Danielle stayed by his side, guiding him through each breath, her own anxiety carefully hidden behind a mask of calm. Finally, the wheels of the plane touched down with a jarring thud, the screech of the brakes filling the cabin as the aircraft slowed to a crawl. Danielle let out a long breath, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. They had made it. The flight attendants moved quickly, opening the door to allow the paramedics on board. Within moments, they were by Cody's side, assessing his condition and preparing to transfer him to the waiting ambulance. Danielle stepped back, allowing them to take over as she gave them a brief rundown of what had happened. "He's stable for now, but he needs immediate treatment," Danielle said, her voice calm but urgent. "He didn't have his inhaler, and we've been using oxygen to keep him breathing." The paramedics nodded, working swiftly as they placed Cody on a stretcher. Melissa followed closely behind, her eyes never leaving her son as the paramedics began wheeling him toward the exit. Just before they reached the door, Melissa turned to Danielle, her face a mixture of gratitude and remorse. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to thank you." Danielle offered a small nod, her expression calm but tired. "Take care of him," she said quietly. "That's all that matters right now." Melissa nodded, her lips trembling as she followed the paramedics off the plane. The cabin remained silent as the door closed behind them, the tension finally breaking as the other passengers began to stir. Danielle stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the past few hours settle over her. She had done what she always did, saved a life. But the emotional toll of the night weighed heavily on her. The unspoken conflicts and quiet victories tangled together in a way that left her feeling both triumphant and exhausted. As the paramedics left, the hum of conversation in the cabin began to pick up again. The other passengers were slowly coming out of their shocked silence, their voices low and tentative, as if unsure how to process what had just happened. Danielle could feel their eyes on her, but this time, the weight of their stares didn't feel like judgment. It felt like respect. She returned to her seat, feeling the weariness settle into her bones as she sank into the chair. Her muscles ached from the tension of the last few hours, and her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She was relieved that Cody was safe, but the emotional aftermath of the confrontation with Melissa still hung over her like a storm cloud. Emma, the flight attendant, approached her quietly, her face filled with sympathy. "Dr. Carter," she began, her voice soft. "Thank you so much for everything you did. I don't know how we would have handled it without you." Danielle nodded, offering a tired smile. "I'm just glad he's okay." Emma hesitated for a moment, then glanced around the cabin before speaking again. "You handled everything so gracefully, even after what happened earlier with that woman. I'm so sorry you had to go through that." Danielle's smile faded slightly, her eyes turning distant as she remembered the scene from earlier. The way Melissa had demanded that she be moved, the cold look in her eyes, the utter lack of respect. It all felt so distant now, overshadowed by the crisis that had unfolded afterward. But the hurt was still there, lingering beneath the surface. "It happens more often than you'd think," Danielle said quietly, her voice tinged with a hint of weariness. "But that doesn't make it any easier." Emma nodded, her expression filled with quiet understanding. "If there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable, please let me know." Danielle nodded in thanks, but all she wanted now was peace. As Emma left, Danielle leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment. The other passengers were still whispering, their voices a low hum that drifted through the cabin. But Danielle wasn't listening. She was too tired to care about what they thought. Too tired to wonder if the respect they now showed her was genuine, or if it was simply born out of the fact that she had saved a life in front of their eyes. The businessmen from earlier, the ones who had mocked her move to economy, were now quiet. Danielle glanced at them briefly, catching the nervous flicker of their eyes as they avoided her gaze. She could see the discomfort in their faces, the subtle shift in their posture. They had seen her differently before, dismissed her, judged her. But now their opinions had shifted, and it was clear that they were uncomfortable with that realization. Danielle sighed, her mind drifting back to Melissa. The woman's tearful apology echoed in her thoughts, a stark reminder of how easily people could change their tune when they realized they were wrong. But the apology didn't erase the hurt. It didn't undo the fact that Melissa had judged her without knowing anything about her. And yet, in the end, Danielle had chosen to rise above it. She had done her job, saved Cody's life, and set aside her own feelings in the process. It was what she had always done. But tonight, the weight of it all felt heavier than usual. As the plane began its final preparations for takeoff to Atlanta, Danielle allowed herself to close her eyes, letting the hum of the engines wash over her. She would process everything later: Melissa's apology, the other passengers' newfound respect, the bitterness that still lingered in her chest. For now, all she wanted was a moment of quiet, a moment to breathe. The plane had landed at Denver International Airport, and Cody had been rushed into an ambulance waiting on the tarmac. Danielle watched from the doorway of the plane as the paramedics worked quickly, Melissa hovering close to her son, still pale with fear. The flight crew was busy coordinating with the ground staff, ensuring the rest of the passengers remained seated while the medical team did their job. Danielle stood in the jetway, a little removed from the rest of the cabin, feeling the cool night air drift in from outside. Her pulse was still elevated, her mind replaying the last few hours in sharp, vivid detail. The adrenaline that had carried her through Cody's emergency had begun to wear off, leaving a heavy weight in its place, a mixture of exhaustion and emotional fatigue. She had done her job. She had saved Cody. But the events of the night, the confrontation with Melissa, the judgment she had faced from the other passengers, still gnawed at her. The silence in the first-class cabin had been the hardest to bear. No one had spoken up for her, and even now as they sat safely on the ground, she knew most of them would prefer to forget what had happened. The paramedics lifted Cody into the back of the ambulance, and Melissa turned to look back at the plane, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Danielle. Their gazes locked for a moment, and Danielle could see the storm of emotions in Melissa's face: relief, guilt, gratitude, and something else, something unspoken. Danielle nodded at her, offering a small, reassuring smile before turning back toward the cabin. She didn't need to hear the words Melissa might have wanted to say. It was enough to know that Cody was in good hands, and that Melissa had seen what she hadn't before. But the heaviness in her chest lingered. There was no satisfaction in being right when it came at the cost of such an emotional ordeal. The flight attendants had begun preparing the cabin for takeoff once more, and Danielle made her way back to her seat. As she walked down the aisle, she felt the eyes of the passengers following her, their expressions a mix of awkward sympathy and quiet admiration. The businessmen who had made the snide remarks earlier now sat in stiff silence, their eyes cast downward. It was clear that they had reevaluated their initial judgments, but their silence still felt empty. Too little, too late. Danielle slipped into her seat, leaning back and closing her eyes as the sounds of the plane began to fade into the background. She had hoped for rest during this flight, but now the thought of closing her eyes and drifting off felt impossible. The weight of the night's events hung over her like a shadow, refusing to let her go. The flight attendant Emma returned to check on her. "Dr. Carter," she said softly, crouching beside Danielle's seat. "I just wanted to thank you again. I don't know what we would have done without you." Danielle opened her eyes, offering a tired but grateful smile. "You're welcome, Emma. I'm just glad Cody is okay." Emma hesitated, glancing around the cabin before speaking again. "It wasn't just that. I'm sorry about what happened earlier with that woman. You shouldn't have been treated that way." Danielle's expression remained neutral, though she appreciated Emma's sincerity. "It happens," she said quietly, "more often than it should." Emma's face tightened with discomfort. "Well, for what it's worth, you handled everything with so much grace. I'll be writing a report to the airline, and I'll make sure they know exactly what happened tonight." Danielle nodded, though she knew that no report would truly change the underlying issues that had led to the situation in the first place. She had faced prejudice her entire life, and she knew that it wasn't something a single incident could fix. But Emma's gesture was kind, and Danielle appreciated it. "Thank you," she said softly. I appreciate that. Emma smiled briefly before standing and moving on to the other passengers, leaving Danielle alone with her thoughts once more. After about an hour on the tarmac, the flight was cleared for takeoff again. The passengers had grown restless, but no one complained. Perhaps out of respect for what had happened, or perhaps because they were simply too shaken to care. As the plane ascended into the sky, Danielle leaned her head against the window, watching the city lights of Denver fade into the distance. The cabin was quiet now, the passengers subdued, but the silence didn't bring Danielle the peace she had hoped for. The events of the night continued to play on a loop in her mind. The moments of tension, the hostility from Melissa, and the fear that had gripped everyone during Cody's attack. Danielle had thought she could move past it, but the anger still simmered beneath the surface, a low, persistent burn that refused to go away. She had risen above it, yes. She had done what was right, even in the face of blatant disrespect. But why should she always have to be the biggest person? As the plane reached cruising altitude, the flight attendant made her way back through the cabin, offering refreshments. Danielle declined, her stomach too knotted with frustration to even think about eating. She needed to focus, to process what had happened, and figure out how to move forward. Just as she was about to settle back into her seat, she heard a voice. "Doctor Carter?" Danielle looked up to see Melissa standing in the aisle, her eyes swollen from crying. She was clutching her hands together nervously, her expression filled with remorse. Can I sit with you for a moment?" Melissa asked, her voice shaky. Danielle hesitated, her emotions still too raw to engage in any sort of meaningful conversation. But she could see the desperation in Melissa's face, the genuine regret. And she knew that the woman was struggling with more than just the guilt of forgetting her son's inhaler. With a small sigh, Danielle nodded. "Sure." Melissa slid into the seat across from her, her movements tentative, as if she wasn't sure she deserved to be there. She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated, her eyes filling with tears once more. I don't even know where to start," Melissa said, her voice thick with emotion. "I treated you so horribly earlier, and now, after everything you did for Cody, I just don't know how to make it right." Danielle looked at her, her expression unreadable. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "Why did you assume I didn't belong in first class?" Melissa's face crumpled, and she wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I don't know. I know, but I didn't think. She shook her head, struggling to find the words. "I grew up in a place where people like me we weren't exposed to people like you. I was raised to think about certain things, and I didn't question it." Danielle's stomach twisted. She had heard this story before, countless times. The excuses, the explanations. People weren't born with hate in their hearts, but they were taught to see others as different, as lesser. And sometimes that teaching went so deep, people didn't even realize they were carrying it with them. "I thought you were going to judge me," Melissa admitted, her voice breaking. "I saw you sitting there, and I just assumed you didn't belong, that you were going to look down on me. And I don't even know why I thought that. But then you helped Cody, and you saved him. And I don't know how to fix what I did." Danielle's chest tightened with a mixture of sadness and anger. She had faced this kind of prejudice her entire life. People making assumptions about her, doubting her abilities, treating her as if she didn't belong. And yet, here was Melissa, finally realizing the weight of her own biases, asking for forgiveness as if that would erase what had happened. "You can't fix it," Danielle said softly. "You can't undo what you did, but you can start by examining why you felt that way in the first place." Melissa's tears flowed freely now, and she nodded, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "I will. I swear I will." There was a long silence between them, the only sound of the low hum of the airplane engines as they cruised through the night sky. Danielle watched Melissa carefully, sensing the woman's genuine remorse, but knowing that this moment of clarity didn't mean everything would change overnight. "I don't need your apology, Melissa," Danielle said finally, her voice steady but firm. "What I need is for you to take what happened tonight and learn from it. Teach your son differently. Make sure he grows up seeing people for who they are, not what they look like." Melissa nodded quickly, her lips trembling as she wiped at her eyes. I will, she whispered again, her voice filled with resolve. Danielle studied her for a moment longer, then sighed, leaning back in her seat. That's all I ask. Melissa sat there for a few moments more, her face etched with guilt and determination. Finally, she stood, her hands still shaking slightly as she whispered one last thank you before returning to her seat. Danielle watched her go, feeling the weight of the conversation settle in her chest. She had heard these kinds of apologies before, had seen people realize their mistakes and vow to do better. But change was hard, and it wasn't something that happened in a single conversation. It took time, and it took effort. But as she watched Melissa return to her seat, her shoulders slumped with the weight of what she had learned tonight. Danielle allowed herself a small sliver of hope. Maybe this time, it will be different. As the flight continued its journey to Atlanta, Danielle remained in her seat, staring out the window at the dark expanse of sky. The conversation with Melissa had left her feeling drained, but there was also a sense of resolution, a quiet understanding that while the world wasn't perfect, there was always room for growth. Danielle's mind drifted back to her childhood, to the lessons her parents had taught her about resilience and strength. Growing up as a black girl in the South, she had learned early on that the world would not always be kind, that people would judge her before they knew her. But her parents had also taught her to stand tall in the face of adversity, to let her actions speak louder than words. And tonight, that's exactly what she had done. She hadn't needed to prove herself to Melissa or anyone else on that plane. Her actions had spoken for her skills, her knowledge, her compassion. And in the end, that was what had made the difference. As the plane began its descent into Atlanta, Danielle allowed herself to exhale. The long journey was almost over, and soon she would be back in the comfort of her own home, away from the scrutiny of others and the weight of the night's events. But the lessons from tonight would stay with her, just as they always had. Each experience, each confrontation with prejudice, added to the layers of strength she had built over the years. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't easy, but it had shaped her into the person she was today, a person who saved lives, who rose above the hatred and ignorance, and who stood firm in her identity. The plane touched down smoothly, and as the passengers began to gather their belongings, Danielle remained seated for a moment, letting the weight of the night lift from her shoulders. She had done her job. She had done what she always did, and she would keep doing it, because that was who she was. As the passengers filed off the plane, several of them nodded at her, offering small gestures of respect and gratitude. Danielle returned their nods, but her mind was already in the future, on the next flight, the next emergency, the next moment when she would be called to rise above it all once again. And she would, because no matter what the world threw at her, Danielle knew she was strong enough to handle it. As the plane taxied toward the gate at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, Danielle Carter felt a deep sense of relief wash over her. It had been a long, emotionally exhausting journey, one that had tested her patience, her resilience, and her strength in ways she hadn't expected. But she had made it through, and now she was home. The familiar lights of the airport flickered outside the window, and the quiet hum of the engines felt like a lullaby compared to the chaos of the last few hours. Danielle leaned back in her seat, letting the tension ease from her shoulders as she watched the passengers around her slowly begin to gather their things. Despite the fatigue that weighed on her, Danielle couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had done what she came to do, not just as a physician, but as a person. She had saved Cody's life, risen above the prejudice she faced, and handled the night's challenges with the grace and professionalism that had defined her career. But most importantly, she had maintained her integrity, even in the face of blatant disrespect. As the passengers began to file out of the plane, a few of them gave her small nods or murmured quiet thank yous. It wasn't the recognition she sought, she had never needed that, but it was a reminder that her actions hadn't gone unnoticed. Even in the face of adversity, she had proven who she was. Danielle waited until the cabin had cleared before standing and gathering her belongings. Her muscles ached from the long hours of sitting, and her mind still buzzed with the remnants of the night's events. but there was a certain lightness in her step as she made her way down the aisle and toward the exit. As she stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the familiar buzz of the airport greeted her. People rushed past, luggage rolling behind them, conversations blending into a dull hum. For a moment, Danielle simply stood there, taking in the energy of the place. It was the same as always, busy, chaotic, full of people moving on to their next destination. But for her, this arrival felt different. It felt like a moment of closure. With a deep breath, Danielle began to walk toward the baggage claim, her suitcase rolling quietly behind her. She was ready to put the night behind her, to leave the tension and the emotions on the tarmac, and step back into the life she had built, a life defined by purpose and dedication, not by the opinions of others. As she made her way through the terminal, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen to see a message from her friend and colleague, Dr. Angela Moore. "Just finished my shift. How was the flight?" Danielle smiled softly at the message, already imagining how she would recount the night's events to Angela. She and Angela had known each other since their residency days, and there was no one else who understood the unique challenges Danielle faced quite like her. It would be good to talk to someone who got it, someone who could relate. "Long story," Danielle typed back. "I'll fill you in tomorrow." As she hit send, another message popped up, this time from an unfamiliar number. "Dr. Carter, it's Melissa Jenkins. I just wanted to thank you again for everything you did for Cody. He's stable now and the doctors say he'll be okay. I owe you more than I can say. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm working on being better, for Cody's sake and mine. I hope one day I can show you that I've changed. Thank you again." Danielle stared at the message for a long moment, her mind replaying the conversation she'd had with Melissa on the plane. The apology, the tears, the genuine remorse in Melissa's voice. It had all been real, but Danielle knew that true change wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, effort, and reflection. Still, the message felt like a small step in the right direction. With a sigh, Danielle pocketed her phone and continued toward the baggage claim. She didn't respond to Melissa's message, at least not yet. It wasn't about whether or not she forgave Melissa. It was about whether Melissa could take what had happened and truly grow from it. That would take more than a text message, but it was a start. As Danielle arrived at the baggage carousel, she spotted her suitcase almost immediately, grabbing it and making her way toward the exit. The cool Atlanta air greeted her as she stepped outside, and for the first time in hours, she felt like she could truly breathe. The taxi ride from the airport to Danielle's home was quiet, giving her plenty of time to reflect on everything that had happened. As the city lights blurred past the window, she thought about the weight of the night's events, the emotional highs and lows, the moments of fear, and the quiet triumphs. In the emergency room, Danielle had grown used to dealing with life or death situations. Every shift brought a new crisis, a new set of challenges that tested her skills and her ability to remain calm under pressure. But what she had faced on the plane tonight had been different. It wasn't just about saving a life. It was about confronting the prejudice that had been aimed at her, about navigating the fine line between professionalism and the emotional toll of being judged for something as arbitrary as the color of her skin. Melissa's apology had been sincere, but Danielle knew that it wasn't an isolated incident. The world was full of people like Melissa, people who carried prejudice with them, often without even realizing it. And for people like Danielle, that prejudice was a constant presence, something she had to confront in both subtle and overt ways, time and time again. But tonight, she had chosen to rise above it. She had done what she always did, used her skills, her compassion, and her resilience to help those in need, regardless of how they had treated her. It wasn't about proving herself to anyone else. It was about staying true to who she was. As the taxi pulled up to her house, Danielle paid the driver and stepped out into the quiet street. The familiar sight of her home brought a sense of comfort that she hadn't realized she was craving. It was a modest but cozy place, nestled in a quiet neighborhood just outside the heart of the city. For Danielle, it was her sanctuary, her place of peace, after long shifts in the chaos of the emergency room. She walked up the steps to her front door, unlocking it and stepping inside. The warmth of the house enveloped her, and for the first time all night, she felt the full weight of her exhaustion. She set her bags down by the door, kicking off her shoes as she made her way to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water. As she sipped the cool water, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The night had been challenging, yes, but it had also reminded her of why she did what she did, why she had chosen this path, despite the obstacles. Being an emergency physician wasn't just about saving lives. It was about being a source of strength in the face of fear, a beacon of hope when things seemed hopeless. And while the prejudice she had faced tonight was painful, it hadn't broken her. If anything, it had reminded her of her own resilience, of the quiet power she carried within her. She had faced darkness, both in the medical emergency and in the judgment of others, and she had emerged on the other side, stronger than before. The next morning, Danielle awoke to the soft light of dawn filtering through her bedroom window. Her body ached with the lingering fatigue of the night before, but there was a sense of peace that accompanied her exhaustion. She had made it through another challenge, and today she would return to the hospital, ready to face whatever came next. As she got dressed, Danielle's mind drifted back to the moments on the plane. Cody's labored breathing, Melissa's tearful apology, the silent stares of the other passengers. It was all so fresh, but it felt like it had happened a lifetime ago. Before heading out for her shift, Danielle sat down at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and her phone. She scrolled through her emails, catching up on the work she had missed while traveling. There were messages from colleagues, updates on patients, and a few reminders about upcoming meetings. It was the usual flurry of activity, but it felt grounding, a return to normalcy after the emotional intensity of the flight. As she finished her coffee, she noticed a new message in her inbox from Melissa. "Dr. Carter, I just wanted to let you know that Cody is doing much better this morning. The doctors say he'll make a full recovery. I can't thank you enough for what you did, and I'm still thinking about everything we talked about. I know it's a long road ahead, but I'm committed to making changes, for Cody and for myself." Danielle read the message twice, letting the words sink in. There was a part of her that wanted to respond, to offer Melissa encouragement or advice, but she knew that real change had to come from within. It wasn't something that could be handed to someone. Melissa's journey was her own, and while Danielle had played a part in sparking that change, it was up to Melissa to continue down that path. She set the phone down and finished getting ready for work. As she stepped out of her house and into the crisp morning air, she felt a sense of renewal. The events of the night before would stay with her, as all such experiences did, but they wouldn't define her. She had more important things to focus on: patients to treat, lives to save, and a future to build. As she drove to the hospital, the city of Atlanta awakening around her, Danielle allowed herself a small smile. The world was far from perfect, and there would always be challenges ahead. But she had faced them before, and she would face them again, with strength, with resilience, and with grace. Thank you for following Danielle's powerful journey. If this story moved you, if it resonated with you on any level, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We share more inspiring, heartfelt stories that will challenge the way you see the world and connect with the experiences of others. Every like, every comment, and every subscription helps us bring more stories like Danielle's to life. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest videos. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so be sure to leave a comment below about how this story touched you or how it made you think about resilience and compassion in new ways. Stay tuned for more stories that will inspire, challenge, and uplift. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.